Welcome back to this little series that I've got going on, cataloging the different decades of progressive rock. Been having a lot of fun with this, and I hope you guys have too. Last episode, we looked at the 80s and a little bit of the wasteland, even though, the 80s within the progressive rock scene, there wasn't maybe as much within, that decade, but there was a lot of innovation in terms of the production side of work that I feel like the 80s don't get enough credit for in terms of looking at it from a progressive rock standpoint. But from there, we're going to go straight into the 90s, and the 90s is a very different beast in a lot of different ways. I almost feel like the 90s didn't necessarily have the progression within the popular music, but this is where I have kind of labeled the 90s as the resurgence of progressive rock. Before we dive into the specifics of this one, the 90s overall, I think, had this kind of carryover of the 80s and late 70s of, the metal music was still pretty prevalent. You had a lot of the whole grunge movement, I think, was the biggest movement within the 90s, as well as like the hip hop and rap. Like, I feel like the late 80s and early 90s, that's where you get a lot of like the really big hip hop and rap music. There was still a lot more in the 90s going on within the prog sphere than I think within the 80s and even within the late 70s. Because as I mentioned, this is where I feel retro prog really started to be born. And this is where I would term the fourth wave of progressive rock. If the first wave was in that really early 70s, the second wave was in the mid to late 70s, the third wave was within the 80s within neo-prog, then the fourth wave is within retro prog. And this was kind of like, if each one was a response to the last, this was the one that saw kind of what the 80s were doing and was like, nah, we want to go right back to that 70s era, and that's where we want to grab our main influences from. So this is where we get bands like Flower Kings. This is where we get bands like Spock's Beard. This is where I believe Marillion continued when Fish left the band in the late 80s and H came on within the 90s. And this is also where you're finding the beginnings of prog being found in other musical tastes and musical genres. Like, this is where mostly Autumn got their start, within the prog folk category. And then Big Big Train also got their start in the 90s. I also feel like this is where a lot of the bands that got their heyday that I'll be talking about in later decades, this is where they got their start. They might not have either put out an album, or if they did put out an album, it wasn't really heard by a whole lot of people. Like, the music industry of the 90s was pretty much the same as it was in the 80s and within the 70s. The main way to discover music is either through music publications like Rolling Stone or Revolver or other kind of publications or magazines like that, or through the radio, and radio was usually just like the top big hits. Those were your main sources to find new music, because the internet wasn't quite a thing in the 90s, or if it was, I didn't get the internet until like the late 90s. So discovering new music was also only found through friends, colleagues, and family members, So if somebody didn't know about a band, you probably wouldn't know about them either. So, like, the discovery of music was still very slow. That would have changed in later decades, but this is why we're talking about it in the 90s. So that's why a lot of those bands that grew to be quite large got their start in the 90s, even though within the 90s themselves they didn't really get a whole lot of recognition. So I'll be talking about those in a little bit, and I use Big Big Train as an example because at least Big Big Train had a little bit of traction. At least they got a little bit of notoriety. Same with Spock's Beard, same with Flower Kings and Marillion. Now, part two of this is the prog bands that started to come back to prog. So we had bands from the 70s that were, capital P prog, that started to go back to their roots. For example, King Crimson put out Construction of Light and Thrack. Now, they never really deviated from the prog movement, but, the 80s were a very singular time for King Crimson. I feel like in the 90s, they started to go kind of back to what they were doing in the 70s, Pink Floyd put out Division Bell, one of their best albums, in my opinion. Rush put out, Test for Echo, Roll the Bones, Presto, to varying degrees of success, if I'm being perfectly honest. I still love Test for Echo. I think it's one of their best. But honestly, I really love what they did in the 2000s. But we'll get to that in our next video. But even Yes, was going back to prog with their Ladder and the Keys, the Studio Keys record that they put out. Now, this is also where I want to talk about part 3, and this is where prog lives on with this adjunct fourth wave of prog. So if we had the emergence of the retro prog with bands, like I said, Flower King, Spock's Beard, Big Big Train, and those kind of folks, I think this other fourth wave of prog really was rooted within this 90s. Just let's experiment again. Let's really embrace that spirit from the 70s, but not necessarily rewrite what was going on in the 70s like those other bands did. So this is where we get the emergence of bands like Tool. This is where we get bands like Porcupine Tree, Pain of Salvation, Anglegar, Anecdoton, even to a certain extent bands like Motorpsycho and Ekelin. But I do feel as if those two bands, once again, will find more success later on. In fact, all these bands will. But this is like that genesis. This is where they begin. And this is, again, where that fourth wave was really starting to pick up momentum and starting to get more airtime. Because a lot of those other bands, they might not have broken through the main airwaves, Like Spock's Beard you might have heard of, but if you were really into that time, you might have heard Porcupine Tree, you might have heard Pain of Salvation, you most likely would have heard about Tool, right? And this is where I want to transition into part 4, which is the metal continues and becomes its own progressive rock subgenre. Because in the 90s, I feel like the seeds that were planted in the 80s of the metal landscape, this was where they started to really start to fruit and really start to flower. So you had bands like Dream Theater that, sure, released their first album in the 80s, but it wasn't until the 90s that they started to put out those big statements. And I feel like Images and Words was the album that really kicked open the door for a lot of the prog metal to really take root. And this is the first wave of prog metal, so bands that had already, toiled the soil, planted the seeds and started to water them, like you had Fate's Warning, you had Queensryche. To a certain degree, you also had bands like Metallica, Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, the Big Four, even Anthrax and whatnot, like the big hair metal, the glam metal, the thrash metal. These were the ones that were like taking little bits and pieces, but then you had bands like Dream Theater, Symphony X, Camelot, and Cynic that took those influences and then applied them to a progressive rock route. So you had some really amazing styles within that. And this is also where kind of that first wave of the more tech and extreme metal started to incorporate, and they were really rooted immediately into progressive rock. So this is where we get bands like Meshuggah, where they continued. They started in the 80s, but I feel like they really got their feet under them in the 90s. You got bands like Opeth, for sure. Gojira, Mastodon, and Strapping Young Lad that would then just go straight into Devin Townsend. You couldn't have asked for a better, nurturing ground for progressive metal than what we had within the 90s. And this was really that same kind of landscape of the early 70s for prog. I feel like the landscape was perfect and very nurturing for the metal landscape within the whole landscape within the 90s for metal. So the 90s were kind of a quick and sweet for progressive rock, because there wasn't a whole lot of experimenting within, say, the production side of things. There wasn't a whole lot of experimentation within the actual nitty gritties, unlike within the 80s. But you started to have this return to form, this retroism within the 90s of progressive rock. And I mean, in the 90s, there was a lot of retroism within the media for the 70s. It's a 20-year cycle. So I feel like that was kind of continued. And then in the very, very late 90s, this is where we kind of have this big explosion. So everything was being built up for a lot more to be happening in the 2010s and the I guess the early aughts. Some people call it the aughts. I still call it the 2000s. But this is kind of like that fertile ground for everything to grow. So yeah, you had Porcupine Tree, you had Opeth, and you had Dream Theater. Those were the three big ones. They all got their starts in the 90s and each put out some really seminal albums. Porcupine Tree had Lightbulb Sun, Signify, The Sky Moves Sideways. Opeth had Still Life, My Arms Are Hers. Dream Theater had Images and Words, and they had Awake. So each had these landmark staple prog pieces that would then go and influence other creators later on. So yeah, I think that's what we've got for the 90s. kind of short and sweet for the 90s, honestly. But the same won't be said about the 2000s and moving forward. So from here, this is where retro prog really started to take root, and we will find other big landmarks within the progressive rock landscape. So hope you guys will join me for that. I've been having a lot of fun with these little videos. You know, I'm just having fun doing a kind of a scan of the landscape within these past decades. So yeah, let me know some of the bands that you loved from the 90s. What albums and seminal albums did you love that really helped define the 90s for progressive rock? Let me know all about that by commenting down below. And yeah, I think that's where I'm going to leave you for today. I want to thank you all once again so much for watching and joining me for this little fun video time. You guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.